One of these mornings where you're enjoying so much what you're hearing, you forget that you have to get up and say something yourself. But I think it's kind of fitting and kind of fun for me to be following a great storyteller, because I have a story to tell this morning. It's the story of the scientific rediscovery of God. If I could back it up to the title slide for the conference, 39 years ago, I arrived at St. Catherine's College, having been given a small glimpse of the story I want to tell tonight. And I'm thinking about the verse we heard about boundary lines falling on pleasant places, and in a way I want to give glory to God for bringing me once again back to Cambridge, this most enchanting place. I remember one of the very first seminars I had in the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science. I'd come from a very small college in the United States. Everyone else in my program was from someplace really impressive. And we had adjourned from a seminar to the pub. And there was an American guy who was just as insecure as I was, but he had come from Yale. And, and so at some kind of awkward, inopportune pause in the conversation, he announces to the group that, well, he had become an atheist. And one of the very young, hip lecturers in our department said, well, he said, of course you're an atheist. He said, what else are you that makes you interesting? And I realized, I don't think I'll be sharing my worldview anytime soon. A couple years ago, I was doing an interview with a well-known American media personality, and it was being filmed. And there was a young woman, stage left, who was filming the interview. And about halfway through, as we were talking about some of the scientific evidence that seemingly, I will argue, points to the reality of a creator, this young woman began to visibly weep. And you could see it from people in the audience, and it was a bit awkward and embarrassing for her. Later, she wrote us a letter that came to us through the producer and said, kind of apologizing, but her story, she shared in the process, she shared her story. And it's not dissimilar in a way to the one I just told, in that she explained that throughout her college career, professors would constantly lecture that based on the evidence, she was a science major, that they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in class should believe in God. They'd argue that the science was proven and God was hence a myth. I was not equipped, she said, to present a valid opposition in debate. I was desperate to find commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education, and she went on to say, but I could find none. And she had, from that point, she hadn't rejected her faith in God or Christ, but she lived with a kind of strange cognitive dissonance, feeling like on the one hand there were the facts, and on the other hand there was the faith, and she didn't know how to put the two together. And at overhearing a hint that there might be a way to bring the two together into harmony, to reconcile them, she began to weep. And she then realized how deeply troubling it was that she couldn't find a way to bring these two aspects of her personality together, her belief system. And I think it's in a way, there's a connection between the two stories I've just told, and that is that the university environment on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe, in the West, over the last century and a half, has become progressively more and more secular. And there's a sense that if you are to have a especially scientifically informed worldview, that you're not going to be a believer in God. You're not going to be giving glory and honor to the Creator, as we've been hearing about so beautifully from Andrew. And it's not hard to imagine or to understand how people could have come to this perception. Very powerful voices in our culture have been telling us for quite some time that science properly understood undermines belief in God. We're probably all very familiar, maybe too familiar with the phenomenon of the new atheism, which is, I think, thankfully beginning to wane. If you know Justin Brierley's wonderful new book, The Surprising Rediscovery of Belief in God, you'll know what I mean about the waning. In fact, I think the story I'm going to tell today is part of that story. But Dawkins has had this outsized influence throughout the Western culture, the university culture in particular. His book, The God Delusion, has sold over 3 million copies. Sorry, Andrew, he beat even you, yeah. Making this case that science properly understood undermines belief in God. And he's not the only one. There's this pantheon of scientific atheists. Lawrence Krauss, the universe from nothing. Stephen Hawking, who, great as a physicist, late in life got into this act of kind of atheistic scientific apologetics. Bill Nye, the science guy, not actually a scientist, but he plays one on TV. But then the truly great physicist, Steven Weinberg, I had the chance to eulogize his passing in the Jerusalem Post years ago. And he was a great scientist, but also of scientific atheism. And so these kinds of voices have so much prominence in the culture, have affected young people in a profound way. And so I can understand the insecure classmate all those years ago wanting to establish his intellectual bona fides by saying, hey, I'm an atheist too. Or that young woman who desperately wanted to believe in God but couldn't find a place to stand rationally or scientifically. And so this has been a phenomenon in our culture. Dawkins has been quite explicit. He thinks that the evidence, this isn't just a matter of a belief system, that the evidence supports this kind of scientific atheism, or more properly, scientific materialism. The idea that matter and energy are eternal and self-existent and self-creating, such that there's no need for an external creator to bring the universe into existence or to shape it, to bring about all the things we see around us. And he has this famous quotation, which I think is actually quite helpful. It's a framing quotation. The way he frames the issue is so interesting. I'm going to come back to this several times in the talk. He says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, blind, pitiless indifference for him is a kind of shorthand for the idea of undirected material processes. So what he's saying is so interesting. He's saying that if we look at the world around us, what we see matches what we should expect to see if materialism as a philosophical system is true, if there's nothing but blind, pitiless, undirected material processes at work, no evidence of a designer or a purposeful creator behind the world. This is extremely interesting because what Dawkins is saying in part is that metaphysical hypotheses, worldviews, are as testable as scientific hypotheses. That if you look around you, you can, how do we test a scientific hypothesis? We posit something, then we look at the world. Does the world match what we would expect if our hypothesis is true? If so, we have confirmation of the hypothesis. Dawkins says the metaphysical hypothesis of materialism has been confirmed by what we see around us. Now, that's going to be really interesting for two reasons. One, I'm going to actually contest that. But number two, what's implied in that is that other metaphysical hypotheses might be testable or confirmable by the things we see around us. In any case, we're all familiar with this very dominant materialistic worldview. It's not only affected science, it's percolated out into all the other fields. Now, it's obviously contrary to the biblical view. Psalm 19, the heavens declare, we've already heard the wonderful psalm, declare the glory of God. The writer of the psalm thinks that there's something about the world around us that points to the reality of a designer, a creator, a purposeful creator. Romans 1, we get the same idea. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood, and I italicize, from what has been made. The features, the properties, as Dawkins calls it, of the world around us, in some way are pointing us to or confirming the reality of an unseen realm, an unseen person of power and great intelligence. Now, it's not too surprising that the biblical writers and the authors of the New Atheist books disagree about what science has to say about the reality of a creator. But what might surprise you is that the new atheists, these proponents of science being properly understood, have been advancing a viewpoint that's starkly at odds with the viewpoint of the founders of modern science. This is a famous and lovely quotation from Johannes Kepler. He says, "I was merely, as an astronomer, merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather, above all else, of the glory of God." There's a wonderful book about the scientific revolution that's written by an historian of science that recently passed, published with Princeton University Press, called "For the Glory of God." It tells the story of the founding of modern science in Western Europe in the period that historians often refer to as the scientific revolution, roughly 1500 to 1750. I myself would date it back further into late medieval Catholic Europe. Both the Catholic theologians and the reformers contributed by rediscovering the Hebrew Bible. It's a great ecumenical story of Judeo-Christian thinking giving rise to modern science. All these early scientists were concerned in studying nature to give glory to God. There was a theological motive behind it. And you see this in the book of nature, which Andrew referred to. It's two metaphors of the book of nature, the book of Scripture. But there's an idea implicit in this quotation that was really central to the rise of modern science. And the idea is sometimes called the intelligibility of nature. It was an assumption that the early Christian founders of modern science brought to the study of nature. They believed that because we were made in the image of a creative God, a rational creator, and because that God had endowed us with the same gift of rationality, that we could understand the rationality, the rational order and design that he had built into the world. That there was a principle of correspondence between what John Polkinghorne, the famous physicist from Cambridge a few years ago, used to call the reason within matches the reason without. That the reason that God built into the world is understandable, it's intelligible to us because he made our minds in his image, and he, in his rational intellect, was the source of both the rational order we observe in the world and the reason that he has given us. And that gave scientists, these early, what they were called natural philosophers at the time, it gave them the confidence that we could study nature and that nature would reveal its secrets. It's not easy to come up with something like the universal law of gravitation. But if we study carefully, there are patterns of order and design to be discerned that we can discern. Excuse me. It's the first day in 2 weeks that I did not wake up with a raging sinus infection. So there have been people praying for me, but I'm going to need a swig here. So that's a wonderful presupposition. It's something that the early, mostly Christians who were founding science brought to their endeavor. But it wasn't just that they presupposed that there was a rational order to creation that we could understand. They also, upon investigating nature, believed they were finding evidence of the rationality of the Creator. They were seeing evidence of design. And there's this wonderful tradition that was intricately interconnected with the founding of modern science that's called British natural theology. It's associated with figures like Robert Boyle, who was at Oxford, and many, many important figures who were here in Cambridge. If you catch me after lunch, it wouldn't take much to give you my little walking history of science and theology walking tour of Cambridge. But this is John Ray, one of my heroes. Turns out that he was at the same college where Ranald and I were, only it wasn't called St. Catherine's College at the time, it was called Catherine's Hall. I only discovered this recently. We've come back to Cambridge to found the Whewell Center for Science and Natural Theology to revivify, to recover this tradition of British natural theology here in Cambridge, where it largely started. And it shocked me to learn the college I had attended was where Ray was. And Ray's famous book was The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, in 2 parts. There were a lot of them, a lot to be exposited in the book of nature. What's interesting, does the front piece, the title of the front piece remind you of a Bible passage? This is Romans 1. It's translated slightly differently in the older translations. The wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation. This was the inspiration for it. But he made these elegant design arguments. This is 1680s, way before William Paley. And then, interestingly, this reaches interesting connection. Ray has a dear friend. After being at Catherine's Hall, he goes to Trinity. He connects with a young mathematician there who's the first Lucasian professor, Isaac Barrow. They become close friends. They talk theology, biology, mathematics, natural theology, and then Barrow has a pupil, and it's Newton. And so you see this transmission of ideas. I did in my master's year here quite a lot of work on Newton with one of the great Newton scholars in the History and Philosophy of Science department here. And I remember him taking me aside and saying, if you miss Newton's theism, you've missed everything. And he emphasized that the Principia was a theological project, was the way he put it. What were these principles that Newton was wanting to exposit? They were the principles of rational order that God had imbued into matter that Newton was revealing through, in this case, his work on universal gravitation. And in revealing the laws of nature, you were revealing the ideas in the mind of the Creator, the rational principles that he had built into nature to make nature proceed in its orderly concourse. And this tradition of natural theology reaches an almost majestic height in a subsequent work that Newton published called the General Scholium. This was a theological epilogue or reflection on his earlier work, the Principia. And he not only, in the Principia, he explains how the universal law of gravitation is ordering the planetary system. But in the General Scholium, he makes a very explicit design argument. And it's beautifully put. He says, though these bodies, he's speaking of the planets in orbit, he says, though these bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, capital B. If you've missed Newton's theism, you've missed everything. So all this begs raises an obvious question. How did we get from Sir Isaac Newton and John Ray and Robert Boyle and Johannes Kepler to Richard Dawkins and Bill Nye, the science guy? Well, there's a story here. And the story is a shift, a philosophical shift that begins to take place in the 19th century. There's a particular physicist, a French physicist named Pierre Laplace, whose work is in some way emblematic of what's going to take place throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. He writes a book called The Celestial Mechanics. And in it, he attempts to do what Newton just said you couldn't do, which is explain the origin of the solar system by reference to the law of gravity alone. Newton's idea was that, yes, there's this law-like process that keeps all the planetary bodies in perfect, regular order. But the initial setup of the planets was something that required very intentional, specific arrangements or design. The difference between the initial conditions and the law, if you're a physicist. The law explains why things maintain the order, but you need intelligence, specific inputs of intelligence to explain the initial arrangements that make the solar system stable. Laplace came along and said, well, no, I can explain that, and I can do it by reference to the law of gravity alone, and he published a book called, he published a hypothesis called the nebular hypothesis in this book, The Celestial Mechanics. There's a story then of Laplace being called before Napoleon. He did, in fact, go before Napoleon. Parts of the story may be apocryphal. But he goes before Napoleon, and Napoleon is giving him commendation, in part because there was this enmity between peoples on two sides of a channel, and Newton was English, and he was French. And so Napoleon says, wonderful book that you've written, Pierre, but in Newton's work, we read of God on nearly every page, but in your book, you say nothing about God. And Laplace is said to have puffed himself up and said, Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis. Now, whether he said those exact words or not is uncertain. But William Herschel, who was apparently in the room, did confirm later that this was the spirit of the interaction. And indeed, it's the spirit of much of subsequent 19th century science. As one theory after another is proposed to explain the origin of things without reference to God, a designer, a creator of any kind. In geology, people come along and explain the dramatic features of the Earth's surface, the river deltas, the mountain ranges, the great canyons, by reference to slow, gradual, and purely naturalistic processes. In biology, in 1859, Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. In it, he emphasizes the creative power of a purely natural mechanism, which he calls natural selection, acting on random variations. He's, of course, here also at Cambridge in the late 1820s and early 1830s. There's lots to say about Darwin's theory, but one of the things that's been emphasized, that Darwin himself emphasized, and that later expositors of Darwinism have emphasized, and that is that the theory attempts to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms as a result of unguided, undirected processes. Natural selection is not a directed mechanism, it's a natural mechanism. And so in one of the most prominent American college-level textbooks, the writer Douglas Fatuma, himself an evolutionary biologist, puts it this way. He says, by coupling the undirected, purposeless variations to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of life superfluous. He too had no need of that hypothesis. And so by the end of the 19th century, it becomes possible to tell a kind of seamless story, going back to the origin of the solar system, to the origin of the mountains and canyons and river deltas and great geological features, to the origin of new forms of life. And there are even scientists like Thomas Henry Huxley and Ernst Haeckel who take Darwin's idea, which was meant to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, and they extend that idea to explain the origin of the very first life itself. A theory not of biological evolution, but of what's called chemical evolution, how you get the first cell out of prebiotic chemicals. And so you have this completely seamless, naturalistic story that can be told from this origin of the solar system right through to the origin of life, all subsequent forms of life, and even in Darwin's subsequent work, The Descent of Man, the origin of human life. All without need for that hypothesis, to reference any designer or creator of any kind. And so what arises out of these developments in science, these theories of origin taken collectively, is a kind of worldview, a philosophy, that's sometimes called materialism or scientific materialism or scientific naturalism. How many, this is an apologetics conference, so I suppose I don't need to ask, but how many are familiar with the term worldview? I've been using it a lot, okay? I taught philosophy for a time, and I did units on worldview, but I remember when I was a undergraduate, I had I majored in physics and geology. And one of the reasons I majored in physics was that my father was a mechanical engineer, and I wasn't. And before I was heading off to college, I had a penchant for having my head in the clouds, thinking about philosophical matters. If he'd be fixing the car, asking me to help, hand me the wrench, please. And by the time he asked, I had drifting off, thinking about something else, and I would drop it in the most inaccessible part of the engine, and he'd get frustrated at his impractical son. So I knew when I was going off to college, I didn't want to be an engineer because I couldn't do the things that he did. He could fix anything. And so he took me aside and he said, I know, son, that you don't want to be an engineer, and that's fine. You don't have to do what I did, but let me just give you one piece of advice. Before you choose a major, make sure you take at least 2 years of math at university, because if you don't have the math, you're going to be limited in whatever you can do. I said, okay, Dad. So I was a dutiful son. I took the 2 years of math. I got through the calculus, got through the differential equations, and then I was at a fairly small college, and by the time you do that much math at the college where I was, the only thing you could major in was physics or math. And I chose physics, which is about as close to engineering as you can get, and so I think that's what my dad had wanted all along. But I had a little other card up my sleeve. I would sneak across campus every semester and sign up for one philosophy class. In fact, my first philosophy class was a class that was based on Os Guinness's book, The Dust of Death, which taught comparative worldviews through the lens of Oz's amazing book. In any case, my junior year in college, I was taking a course called Atheistic Existentialism. And I was doing very well. It was all about wallowing in existential despair. And I was very good at it, the lament part, the lament that we want to hear about tomorrow. And so my grade slip came home at the Christmas holiday, and we had in our family this kind of Germanic work ethic. So I'm in university, my dad is still intercepting the report card. And he sits me down at dinner one night, and he says, I want to talk to you about something, in a tone of voice that might not go so well. And he starts reading the grades off, and he says, atheistic existentialism, and he butchers the pronunciation for effect to make clear that he didn't think this was a valuable course. And there was maybe a little bit of profanity in there as well. And then he reads the word a, like that's a bad thing. And then the next grade up is theoretical mechanics, which was my most important physics course that semester, and then it's B. And then I get a look, which in our family meant it's now time for offspring to give account of offspring's behavior. And I get very defensive, and I said, Dad, look, I know these philosophy classes don't mean anything to you, but they're important too, because that's where you learn about worldviews. And worldviews are really important because they're like a framework that everyone has for interpreting the world around us, and they answer certain fundamental questions that aren't addressed in science classes. And everybody has a worldview, and if you learn to study worldviews, you can understand where other people are coming from. And he cuts me off and he says, son, you don't need a worldview. You need a job. And the sad thing is now I'm that dad. And so in any case, I did later get a job teaching worldviews, so it all worked out. But the worldview that, and you all will recognize this because you're so familiar with the concept of a worldview, but the worldview that has been dominating the culture for over a century is materialism or naturalism in the West. In the East, it's different. There's a multiplicity of different views. And one of my former colleagues had a way of capturing the materialistic worldview in contrast to the biblical worldview. He said, if you know the prologue to the book of John, it's in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and you get this idea of that you have God, and you have ideas in the mind of God, and those ideas precede the formation and structuring of the world. But in the materialistic worldview, you could invert that and say, from eternity past, there was no beginning because matter is eternal and self-existent in the materialistic worldview. From eternity past were the particles. And the particles became complex living stuff. They arranged themselves to become more complex chemicals. And those chemicals arranged themselves to become the first cell, living cell. And then that cell evolved by purely undirected, unguided material processes to produce all the forms of life we see. And one of those forms of life evolved sufficiently to become conscious and aware. And the living stuff became aware. And the living stuff conceived of the idea of God. Anyone remember their Freud? God did not create man, man created the idea of God. That's pure applied naturalism or materialism. You find it in Freud as well as Darwin, Marx, and others. Okay, so this is the worldview that's come to predominate the West. And of course, atheism is implicit in this, or at least an aggressive form of agnosticism. What we know exists is matter and energy. We do not know that anything else is beyond that. When I was teaching, I used to create these little worldview diagrams where the big circle represents the physical world, the pendulum represents the laws of nature, the man being moved by the pendulum represents the idea of determinism, that we're completely determined by these physical, chemical laws, and the Ghostbuster sign over the Michelangelo God figure represents the idea that there is nothing beyond the physical world, nothing beyond the universe, and certainly no God, no creator, no designer. And that, I would submit, has become the kind of default way of thinking in the West for a very long time. And what's interesting about that default way of thinking is that it purports to be based on science, on scientific discoveries or scientific theories, many of which coming out of the 19th century. And I've only given a very brief sketch of the rise of scientific materialism during the 19th century. And that way of thinking is still very much with us. Now, the story I want to tell today is a story of reversal. In fact, in my book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe, I talk about 3 major discoveries. Today, I'm only going to talk about 2, and then tomorrow, I'll tell a bit of the rest of the story in a context of discussion about design and biology. So you're only getting part of the story today. But it's an exciting story. And the first major discovery the first inkling of which we start to get in the 1920s, about a century ago, is the idea that the material universe had a beginning. And the story begins in part with a great American astronomer named Edwin Hubble. He comes into astronomy from the field of law at a very propitious time, just as the astronomers are building these great domed telescopes. And this is on the other side of the slide here is the picture of the 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson in Southern California, in Pasadena. And Hubble begins to use this telescope, and with new technology, new photographic plates that are being used to capture light in long exposure, he starts to realize that there are these structures that he and others had been calling nebula. And then using some new techniques for measuring distances, Hubble is able to determine that one of the most dramatic nebular structures is very far away from us. This is the Andromeda Nebula, and it's 900,000 light years away, and the estimate for the size of our Milky Way galaxy at the time was 300,000 light years. And so he realizes that the nebula are not just gas clouds within the Milky Way, which was one of the views at the time, but rather they must be beyond the Milky Way. And in fact, the structure that they have, being like the Milky Way, suggests that they are separate galaxies. And so as Hubble surveys the night sky in all the different quadrants, he ends up finding numerous galaxies. And today you can go online and find these images of the Hubble Deep Field. Today, whereas this is fascinating, in 1924, there are people who still think there's only one galaxy, our own nebula. Because of Hubble's discoveries, within a century, we now realize that there are, I made a mistake in Return of the God Hypothesis. I said 200 billion. I was on one of these podcasts with an astronomer friend of mine. He said, well, you actually got that wrong. The number is now 2 trillion. It's increased by an order of magnitude. So Hubble not only established that we were not alone, our galaxy wasn't the only one, but rather that we live in a vast universe with an literally innumerable number of other galaxies. But he was able to discover something else. As he was surveying the light coming from these distant galaxies, he realized that the light was redder than it would otherwise have been if the galaxies were not moving away from us. This is a phenomenon in astronomy known as the red shift. You remember if you shine light through a prism, it'll separate into different colors, red to violet. The red light has longer wavelengths, or it corresponds to longer wavelengths. And so as you're looking at light, the magnetic spectra associated with a given object, if the spectral lines are shifted toward the red end, if they're longer than they would otherwise be, that's an indication that the object from which that light is coming is moving away from us. And what Hubble discovered is that as he looked at galaxy after galaxy after galaxy in different quadrants of the night sky, that invariably the light was shifted red. That all the galaxies looked as if they were moving away from us. His subsequent grad student, Alan Sandage, who surveyed even more galaxies, found this same pattern emerging over and over again. Now, this is fascinating. In fact, one other thing he discovered was that as the galaxies are moving away, he also found that the ones that were further away, using these new techniques for measuring distance, were moving faster. The further, the faster. Now, to make sense of that, we need a visual aid. In other words, what we're talking about is something like a spherical expansion of space. Something's causing the galaxies to move outward, all of them. So if the ones that are further away are moving faster, the ones that are closer are moving fast but not as fast, that suggests something like a sphere. So it'd be like we could model the history of the universe, the cosmos, moving in the forward direction of time with a balloon. 100 years? 1,000 years? 1,000,000 years? As we go forward in time, the universe is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the galaxies are going to get further and further and further apart. This is what the data is suggesting. The way to interpret the further, the faster relationship and the fact that the galaxies in every direction of the night sky are moving away is that we have an expanding universe. I should have said that right away. That's the synthesis. The universe looks to be expanding in a spherically symmetric way. So far, Hubble has discovered that we're not the only galaxy, that there's a vast multitude of other galaxies, that the galaxies that we see are moving away in roughly a spherically symmetric way. That's all mind-blowing stuff by itself. But now what happens if in your mind's eye you back the time scale up, like those Looney Tune cartoons, where suddenly Bugs Bunny is going backwards in time? What if we think about what the universe would have looked like 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago? It does not matter what your view of the age of the earth or the universe is. However far back you go, eventually you're going to reach what Stephen Hawking called a singularity. You're going to reach a point where all that galactic material would have been densely concentrated in one place, before which you cannot go back any further. Everything is converging backwards to a point, the Hawking singularity. Marking the beginning of the expansion, because now if you go in the forward direction of time, everything is going to expand outward. and arguably the beginning of the universe itself. So that's a kind of mind-blowing conclusion. Now, fast forward to Cambridge, 1960, early 60s. Hawking is doing a PhD on black hole physics. And he begins to think, well, if the universe is expanding in the forward direction of time, as Hubble's taught us, then the matter in the forward direction of time is getting more and more and more diffuse. But in the reverse direction of time, it's getting more and more densely concentrated. So that as you go back further and further in time, you must get to a beginning point. But it's even more profound than that, because by this time we have Einstein's theory of relativity, which tells us that matter is curving space. A massive body curves space. So in the forward direction of time, the universe is getting, the matter is getting more and more diffuse, the curvature of space is getting more and more relaxed, less curvy. But if you back it up in the reverse direction of time, as matter is more and more densely concentrated, space is more and more dense, space is more and more tightly curved, and eventually you get to the point where space becomes so tightly curved that it corresponds to no spatial volume. With an infinite tight curvature in the finite past is going to correspond to zero spatial volume. That's the singularity. So now you've got this profound mystery. You have all matter, all space, all time, all energy coming out of literally nothing physical. Because, well, here's the question. How much stuff can you put in zero spatial volume? How much stuff can you put in no space? You can put no thing in no space, right? So this conclusion from observational astronomy, a la Hubble and company, ends up converging with these developments, profound developments in theoretical physics. Now, mindful of time, turns out I'm only going to tell you one of the great stories, one of the great discoveries. But I'll leave you with this because it's really profound. This is a huge challenge to materialism because you get to a point, the picture of the universe we now have is of all matter, space, time, and energy arising out of this zero point, this singularity, where you have no space, no time, no energy, no matter. And then you get matter, space, time, and energy coming into existence. It's a physical picture of what the medieval theologians used to call creatio and ex nihilo. It also underwrites a reformulation of the ancient cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Causes being separate from their effects, the universe must have a cause separate from itself. So the material universe cannot be explained by material things. If matter itself comes into existence at a finite point in time, then before that, or independent of that, there's no material to do the causing. So we have this profound challenge to materialism. And as you begin to think of, well, what could explain this? If you posit, well, what would provide an adequate explanation? You would have to posit something that transcends or is separate from matter, space, time, and energy, and yet is capable of initiating a great change of state from no thing to everything. That's a volitional type of entity. And so there's a profound new cosmological argument that has arisen because of this discovery that the universe had a beginning. Finally, there was a great American physicist, Arno Penzias, who discovered the background radiation that helped confirm the picture of the beginning of the universe. And he said that the best data we have are exactly what I would have expected if all I had to go on was the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Remember where we started with Dawkins saying the universe has exactly the properties we should expect if we have nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, if materialism were true. Well, here's a great example of something that was discovered that's exactly contrary to what materialists expected, which was the evidence of an eternal self-existent universe. And instead, we have evidence of a definite beginning to the universe, which is what you would expect from a theistic point of view. So that's part one of Return of the God Hypothesis. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stephen. Now, we've got 15 minutes for questions. If you'd like the first question to be, can you tell us the second thing in 5 minutes? I'm open to being the stooge who asks you that question, if you'd like that. Shall we do that?
Let's do that. That's fair.
Could you in 5 minutes tell us the second thing?
Actually,
that would be great.
The second part of the story is quicker. It also involves a Cambridge scientist, Sir Fred Hoyle. In fact, I'll give you a couple slides.
How convenient.
This is a wonderful story in part because it's so Cambridge. Hoyle was very well known, a great astrophysicist, very well known for his staunch scientific atheism. And there's a quote from him. He says, "Religion is but a desperate attempt to find an escape from the truly dreadful situation in which we find ourselves. Many people feel the need for a belief that gives them a sense of security, and no wonder they become very angry with me when I say all this is an illusion." Hoyle coined the term the Big Bang in order to, as a pejorative, to make fun of the idea of the universe coming into existence out of literally nothing physical. He thought that was utter nonsense. But he was trying to make sense within the framework of a different cosmological theory called the steady state theory of how of the abundance of carbon in the universe. He had thought this thing through 9 different ways to Sunday and realized we have to have carbon. It has unique properties. It makes long chain-like molecules that make it possible for chemistry to store information. We need information to build life. We've got to have carbon. He was trying to figure out how we could get carbon. And long story short, he comes up with a way that this can happen. His theory gets tested out at Caltech, and it is amazingly confirmed. But in the process of his theory being tested, he realizes that for carbon to be able to form, there have to be a whole lot of super lucky coincidences. The gravitational force has to be just so within a developing star, and just so in relation to the electromagnetic forces. And he ends up coining this term. It's called fine-tuning. And the idea is that there are numerous physical parameters that have to be just right. We live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where in order to get life, or even basic chemistry, various physical parameters have to fall within very narrow tolerances outside of which life would be impossible. And as Hoyle begins to reflect on this, numerous parameters. One, for example, something called the cosmological constant, which was the outward pushing force that physicists talk about today that's responsible for the expanding universe, has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. There are only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the universe. So the odds of getting that outward pushing force just right are like the odds of a blindfolded person floating in free space trying to find one marked atom, but not just looking in our universe, but rather 10 billion universes our size. The exquisite mathematical precision that makes not just life, but even, again, basic chemistry possible has blown physicists away. There's a physicist who did his PhD here at Cambridge, young Aussie named Luke Barnes, who's written a very good book on this called The Fortunate Universe. The interesting part of the story is that Hoyle, despite his staunch scientific atheism, upon discovering the numerous fine-tuning parameters that were necessary to make life and basic chemistry possible, ends up reversing his worldview. And he's later quoted as saying that a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect must have monkeyed with physics and chemistry in order to make life possible. I always like the way the monkeys make it into the origins discussion. So that's the second story. It's the story of the discovery of the fine-tuning. One really cool little visual that may help with this is John Polkinghorne. When I was a student here, we had him come into our Christians in Science group and give a talk on the fine-tuning. And he had this lovely visual illustration he used to convey the idea. Imagine that you are going out on a journey into space. You're on Star Trek: The Next Generation. You dock at a space station, and there's a big sign that says, universe-creating machine in here. So you go into the room, and he says, it's a thought experiment, so bear with me. And it really is the universe-creating machine. And what do you find in there? You find this console with dials and knobs and sliders, each one representing one of the fundamental physical parameters of the universe. And it turns out that each one is set to a very precise setting. And because you're a physicist, of course you are, you pull out your slide rule and your pencil, and you make some calculations, and you realize that if any one of those dials or knobs or sliders was moved a little bit, one click this way, one click that way, one setting this way or that way, life and even basic chemistry would be impossible. And then he would say, what do you make of that? And I once had a chance to interview him, and I said, well, Sir John, what do you make of it? And he said, well, I don't say that the atheists are stupid. I just say that theism provides a more satisfying explanation.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So we've got 10 more. That was very good. That was 5 exact minutes. We've got 10 more minutes
for.
For
do that earlier with it.
Yeah.